everyone, my name is Dave and welcome back to Zilog and Moto as we officially start the march to 200 episodes now that the first 100 are in the can. It still doesn't feel real, but that video footage doesn't lie. Or does it? Okay, enough silliness aside, if you're not aware of what Zilog and Moto is and this is your first visit to the channel, welcome. On Zilog and Moto, I've got the mission of collecting and reviewing the entire English language library on the 8 and 16-bit Sega consoles, the Master System, the Genesis/Mega Drive, the Sega CD, and the 32X. And note I said English language, not American, so that means you're going to see US releases, European releases, and even Brazilian releases from time to time. And by the numbers, we're about 8% of the way there, so still a long way to go. If this sort of journey sounds interesting to you, I heartily recommend you subscribe, and I'll see you next week for the next 20 years or so. How's that for a commitment? Now, with that bit of shameless self-promotion out of the way, let's talk about this week's game, which, in a way, revolves around shameless self-promotion. You see, Mean Gene, this week we're talking about a game based in the WWF for the first time. Oh, yes! And this game, WWF Super Wrestlemania for the Genesis, which, believe it or not, was the first time a WWF game would appear on any Sega console, releasing in November of 1992, just in time for Christmas, and well ahead of WrestleMania 9, aka that goofy one which featured Jim Ross making his WWF debut in a toga. Yeah, try to get that image out of your head. WWF Super Wrestlemania certainly wasn't the first WWF game to appear on a console. That award goes to the non-Super WWF WrestleMania on NES, which was then followed up with WWF WrestleMania Challenge. By the way, both of those games developed by Rare. By the time 1992 had rolled around, however, the WWF had also had two very successful arcade machines released in WWF Superstars 1989 and WWF WrestleFest 1991. And with the most improved visuals and action in those titles, it was definitely time for the WWF to bring some of that arcade action home. One more bit of developer trivia. Those two arcade games, they came from Technos, the Double Dragon guys. So you could say they knew a little bit about putting together a video game that featured hand-to-hand combat. Now, full disclosure, I'm a wrestling fan. I know, surprise, surprise, a lot of us nerds seem to be. But in my defense, I wouldn't say I'm a huge fan. I've never actually been to a live event, and if the wrestler hasn't ever appeared outside the indies, I probably don't know who they are. It's certainly not real to me, and the people that describe pro wrestling as a male-centric soap opera, they're not wrong. Also, like how there are Sega guys and Nintendo guys, there tend to be fans of specific promotions. In that regard, I'm not a WWF WWE guy. I don't hate the guys up north, but given the choice between Jim Crockett, WCW, and now AEW, which, if you're not watching, you're missing out, as the first 18 months has had some fantastic moments. But I bring this all up because this is a WWF game, and I just want to be clear that the review of the game is purely based on the game itself, and not me being mad that it doesn't feature Sting, Luger, and the Four Horsemen. Although, it'd be a lot cooler if it did. Anyway, enough fanboying, let's get to the review, but first, the standard and actually somewhat surprising this time, look at the package. And this is WWF Super Wrestlemania for the Genesis. This copy is in pretty good shape, with no damage to the outer cover that I can tell, no scratches, rips, or tears. The one obvious thing is that the hang tab has been removed at the top, but it was done very smoothly, so that you can barely tell it was ever there at all, and actually looks similar to how Sonic looked last week, even though that package never had a hang tab to begin with. Also, this copy has been taken care of, as there's no water or sun damage to the inner cover either, which is nice. It's probably been sitting on a shelf for a good portion of the last 30 years, which is where it's going to spend the next 20 as well. As far as the front cover goes, I actually like this cover a lot. At the time, Sega's first-party titles were using one of the early black box formats, and as a result, they didn't take up the full cover. Now, I do actually like how those first-party releases look for the most part, but it's also nice to have cover art that actually takes up the entire canvas. And seeing this picture of Hogan mean mugging for the camera definitely makes the cover pop from across the room. Not to mention the perfectly sized logo at the top, with the WWF graphic neatly tucked into the very top.
Fun fact, until doing this review of WWF Super Wrestlemania, I was under the mistaken impression that the game's official title was just Super Wrestlemania, because of how understated the WWF logo was. Oops. Well, at least now it's properly grouped with its brethren. Also, on the cover, if Hogan wasn't enough for you in 1992, there's Savage, Warrior, DiBiase, and Papa Shango? I know Shawn Michaels was pretty young at the time, but 0 people were buying this game to play as Papa Shango. His match for WrestleMania 9 didn't even make TV, and he lost to freaking Tito Santana during the El Matador run. Yikes. The years have clearly not been kind to that choice. Flipping over to the back, and just like the front cover, I really like this rear cover as well. Sometimes the third-party titles, especially sports titles, tended to have crappy, hastily thrown together graphic designs for their covers and manuals. But thankfully, this is not the case here. In fact, WWF Super WrestleMania has what might be the record for all titles I'm going to look at on Zilog and Moto in 18 screenshots from the game. 18! Every picture is decent quality, showing off the detail used in the game, and a great sales job, including shots of every wrestler's included finisher. Something I'll be talking more about in a minute, because there's a reason Flying Edge / Acclaim wanted to show them off. The flavor text is good as well, spelling out all the main game modes, with the mention of the Survivor Series matches definitely getting my attention. If I rated games based on the cover alone, this would be the elusive 5-star game. It's that good. Opening up the box, and you see the cartridge is in good shape, and the manual not looking bad either. Yeah, it's got a little curling on the front of the cover, but I've seen so much worse. This is actually a pretty thick manual, and just like the cover of the box, Flying Edge really outdid themselves with the manual. It's still in black and white, just like all the Genesis manuals are, but there's tons of screenshots in here showing off all the moves, and also very handy charts to remind you of what the buttons do and how to do the special moves of each of the wrestlers. And if all that wasn't enough, there's a separate section at the end that features pictures and bios of each of the wrestlers, so that even the novice wrestling fan would be able to understand who's who and what's going on. Well, I can't say enough about how impressed I am with the job that Flying Edge / Acclaim did with packaging this release. It was definitely not expected. I just hope that the game that comes in this box lives up to that potential. However, I fear that graphic design was the easy job here. WWF Super WrestleMania wasn't just an exclusive release for the Genesis, as it also got a release for the Super Nintendo, as you might expect. But the versions were actually a bit different, with both games featuring wildly different rosters. I'm not exactly sure why that was, but from what I'm seeing, it appears that the Super Nintendo version actually came out in March of 1992, in time for WrestleMania 8, and the WWF was a vastly different place at that time. To be clear, the Super Nintendo version features a lineup of Hulk Hogan, Macho Man Randy Savage, $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase, Jake the Snake Roberts, The Undertaker, Sid, the Legion of Doom, and the Natural Disasters, while the Genesis version only keeps Hogan, Savage, and DiBiase, and instead adds IRS, Papa Shango, Ultimate Warrior, Shawn Michaels, and the British Bulldog. If you counted there, yes, the Super Nintendo version ended up with 10 wrestlers to the Genesis 8, but to be fair, 2 of those were the Natural Disasters. I kid. Now all 10 of Earthquake's fans are going to come after me. Also, along with having wildly different rosters, there's one other major difference between the two titles. Remember how when I was looking at the rear cover of the game and it made a point to feature how each of the 8 wrestlers had their finisher included in the game? Well, that's because in the Super Nintendo version, they sorta didn't put any of those moves into the game. Yes, that's right, in the Super Nintendo version, it really doesn't matter who you choose as everyone plays exactly the same. Now, that's not to say that the Genesis version doesn't play extremely similar, but anyone who's familiar with professional wrestling knows that the wrestlers' finishing maneuvers are part of who they are, and it's part of what gets the crowd so excited during matches. So, the Genesis version getting this feature is actually a huge win, and I'd say that makes it superior to the Super Nintendo version, even with it having 2 less wrestlers. Also, the games have so many structural differences, I'm really surprised that they stuck with the same name for the Genesis version, but maybe they figured name recognition was more important. Okay, so we've got 8 larger-than-life stars to play with, but what can we do with them? Well, for a relatively early pro wrestling game, there's actually a decent amount of game options. For starters, you can wrestle one-on-one against the computer, or a tag team match, or even a Survivor Series match. If you're not familiar with the WWF, a Survivor Series match, which is named for the pay-per-view event of the same name that it comes from, is a 4-on-4 tag team match, but unlike your normal tag team match, it's not over after one person gets pinned. Instead, when one person is pinned, they're eliminated from the match, but the match continues until one team has lost all of their members. I really like the fact that they included the Survivor Series match style in the game, as while it's really just a beefed up tag match with a special stipulation, it's different enough from just a regular one-on-one or tag team match to give the game some much needed variety. Also, for each of these 3 types of matches, they can be played in 1 or 2-player modes. That might sound like a silly thing because, of course, a wrestling game is going to be 2-player. The designers would have been insane to not include a 2-player mode. But, as I've found out from doing these last 100 reviews, you can really never take anything for granted. 2-player mode works just as you would expect it to, with the first and second player either competing head-to-head in a one-on-one match on opposing tag teams or leading rival Survivor Series teams. With all the wrestlers essentially playing exactly the same, some of the strategy that you might be expecting is gone, but you can at least say that 2-player matches will always be evenly matched, with the winner usually being the more skilled of the 2 players, as there are no bad stylistic matchups or artificial handicapping. Even without that, however, I could definitely see players going back and forth for hours at a time trying to pull off their favorite wrestlers' finishers for bragging rights while trash-talking each other. 2-player mode is limited to just adversarial gameplay, as there's no co-op play available. You can't pick wrestlers that are on the same team to go against the computer, which makes sense with how the game is designed, because whoever wasn't actually competing in the ring would just be sitting in the corner waiting their turn, even though anyone who's ever seen a tag team match knows that's not how tag matches actually go down. Baby steps as far as game design goes, I guess. Along with those single and 2-player modes, there's one more game mode available to the player, and it's what any prospective wrestler wants, a chance at the WWF Gold. To get there, you must beat each of the other 7 wrestlers in a tournament, wrestling one person after another until eventually no one is left and you've vanquished all comers. This is the game's primary focus outside of 2-player mode, and probably the one that will get the most time from players. As fun as the one-off game modes are, especially the Survivor Series match, everyone wants that strap. Unfortunately, the tournament mode is also where the wheels come off the game a little bit. Actually, more than a bit. Tournament mode takes all the fun that you probably had in any of the single-player modes and throws it through the barbershop window. And if you're younger than 40, you may not get that reference, and I really don't care. The problem with tournament mode is that while in all the other single-player modes, you could choose between easy, medium, and hard difficulties. Tournament mode, on the other hand, offers you no respite of being able to turn down the difficulty. Now, those of you that enjoy a challenge may like it, but to me, it's just frustrating, as it seems that after the first 2 matches, the difficulty is ramped up to a place to where you have to be pretty cheap to get a win, and even then, you're not guaranteed to make it to the next match, as the computer can put a hurting on you with just about anyone and quickly. And it doesn't help matters that some wrestlers, like Ultimate Warrior and Papa Shango, can hit their finishers on you while you're just standing there expecting to go toe-to-toe, and then all of a sudden, you're on your back looking up at the lights. The designers were nice enough to include the ability to continue in the form of a rematch 3 times, but even with those continues, you'll be hard-pressed to bring home the gold. A lot of the issues that the tournament has simply go back to how the game controls. Now, actually, I like the game's control scheme. It's pretty simple. All the wrestlers have the same moves, with the same buttons, so learning how to play the game really just consists of putting in a few rounds, and you should have the basics down. Starting out, A goes for grapple, B kicks, and C punches. If you do get into a grapple, you then rapidly hit the button that goes with the next move you want to pull off. Either A for a headbutt, B for a body slam, and C to whip the wrestler into the ropes. If you choose to whip the wrestler into the ropes, you then again have three options when they come back at you. A to pull off a hip toss, that'll throw the wrestler out of the ring if you're close enough. B for a drop kick, and C for a clothesline. But these moves have the added wrinkle of needing to time your move properly, or else you'll be the one taking the punishment. And with those controls, you have about 90% of the game. Some may think that's too simple, but I really like the idea of being able to just pick up and play the game without having to practice specific combinations over and over again, or having to learn largely different movesets between different wrestlers. But I started out the paragraph stating that the tournament mode controls are a major reason why I have a problem with it. And that's true. The controls have two specific issues. Getting your attacks in can be a case of timing. And if the computer beats you to the punch, pun fully intended, you're probably looking at taking a combination of 2 or 3 moves at least. And as the difficulty ramps up, the computer definitely gets quicker, making that timing issue a larger problem. Also, the combat system can be somewhat funny about which attacks land and which don't, depending on where you're standing in comparison to the other player. And the harder the game gets, the more it seems like that you're out of position to get in an attack. Finally, remember how I mentioned that grapple attacks are based on who wins the tug-of-war of who hits their button the fastest? Yeah, good luck at hitting a button faster than the computer. The game's visuals are a bit of a mixed bag. I like the digitized pictures of the different wrestlers, and when the wrestlers come out to the ring, they do resemble their real-life counterparts, for instance with Hogan and his trademark blonde mustache, or the Ultimate Warrior with bright red face paint. And the designers seem to give each of the different moves a decent amount of animation frames. Hitting a dropkick on a wrestler running at you is a thing of beauty. And I do enjoy when a wrestler is eliminated in Survivor Series mode, watching them have to do the long walk of shame to the back. But outside of the ring setting, the game has no other graphics to speak of. And while I like the look of the ring, complete with announcers and an announce table, those announcers and the rest of the audience are totally static. It's like wrestling in front of an oil painting. Also, to make matters worse, take a close look at the fans. They all have the same face. Just lazy. The in-game sound doesn't fare quite as good as the graphics. The soundtrack to the game is not great. I'm not sure I'd call it bad, but it's close. Also, they tried to include each of the wrestlers' themes to be played when they win a match in tournament mode. And Savage's Pomp and Circumstance sounds pretty good, but for everyone else's theme, you really have to listen hard to pick it out. Hogan's Real American and Michael's Sexy Boy are both pretty laughable. There's no in-match music, just the low, constant hum of the crowd, and the only time they cheer is after a pin. It's kind of hard to get excited about the in-ring action when there's no pop. The sound effects aren't bad, and in fact, I'd say this is the rare case of a game having better sound effects than music, but don't get carried away. They're mainly just your usual smacks and grunts that you would expect in a combat game. WWF Super Wrestlemania is a bit of a perplexing game to me. On the one hand, I really love the relatively simple and easy to pick up control scheme. And single player matches where you can pick your difficulty are pretty fun, because you can really have what feels like an actual match with varied moves. Also, the inclusion of the Survivor Series mode really brings some fun to the table, and I especially like the little details like having to pin a guy on your side of the ring, or else one of their teammates will come in to break it up. Unfortunately, tournament mode throws all that out the window, and you end up just trying to survive the onslaught, or else risk losing what might be a very quick match. Also, only having 8 wrestlers will get old pretty quickly, with only one move separating each of them, and no differences in strength or speed. All in all, I'm giving WWF Super Wrestlemania 2 stars, as I'm going to give the game some slack because it's the first wrestling game for the Genesis. In the United States, anyway. I see you, Wrestle War. And I do think there was an effort to produce a quality game here, especially as evidenced from the packaging. There's definitely room for improvement, though, and I hope I see that in the sequels.
Okay, that was WWF Super Wrestlemania. Calling this game Super Wrestlemania might be a bit of a stretch, as honestly it's more of a Backlash or some other pay-per-view that isn't one of the big four. You know, nothing really memorable happens, and you've mostly forgotten about it by the time the next big event on the schedule rolls around. This game is honestly better than I was expecting in a first effort from Acclaim, knowing some of the turds they released back in the day, but that's not saying a ton. Tune in next week when, for the first time on Zilog and Moto, I review the second game in a series of games. I've mentioned this before, but I've set up the schedule so that if there's a series of games, every 100 episodes I look at the next game in that series. Way back in episode 2, I reviewed Bill Walsh College Football for the Genesis. I don't really remember why, as it wasn't college football season, but whatever, that's what got picked. So now, we'll be looking at not a sequel, but the Sega CD version. I'm curious to see what's been added, and if there's really any meaningful difference between the two. Please remember to subscribe if you like this video, and remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.